Hey everyone, I'm Mike Henry, and this is my Procreate 4.1 demo for the piece I call...
What was that noise?
So, as you know, I'm a big Metal Gear fan, or at least I think as you know, I did the Big Boss piece a while ago, and actually right after I finished that older Big Boss piece, meaning older when he's older, I tried to recreate sort of what he looked like in Metal Gear Solid 4. I actually started this, and I did like a little bit here and a little bit there, and then as time went on, I just very slowly did this. This rough sketch that you're watching right now, I did probably the same day that I posted the Big Boss piece, and then I was like, cool, this looks really good, and then had probably 3 or 4 pieces going at the same time, and just sort of never really did it in earnest. I didn't really sit down and actually finish it. So I just did a little bit here, a little bit there, and then recently I really put in the effort to just wrap it up. So this wasn't even completely drawn until about a week and a half ago, and then I just sat down and finally finished it. So at this point in the design, you see that I bring in this piece from the Metal Gear, I think it was the Legacy collection, and I think that's what it was called. And so this is official art, and I wanted just like good reference for what David's outfit looked like. I mean, Snake's outfit looked like. So this piece for the longest time was just called David. That's why I said that. So that's where I brought it in so I could get all these little armor bits right, because even though I've played a lot of Metal Gear, you know, really truly memorizing what that exact costume looks like, I just don't draw it that often. So this is not only a companion piece, sort of, to the Big Boss piece, this is also almost like a recreation of a Solid Snake piece that I did years ago, where he's got his back up against something and he's looking out of the corner of his eye, and Vulcan Raven is in the background. And so in a lot of ways, this, you know, it obviously feels the same way. I feel like, you know, half the people probably that draw a Solid Snake have his back up against something and he's looking around the corner or something. But so it was really nice to sort of revisit the same vibe as that original piece. When I did that, I really thought I was onto something stylistically, and now when I look at it, it looks like a complete mess. So I got that going for me at least. So here now we are getting into the tight lines. The rough is done. But one of the things you'll notice about the rough is that his gun, the MK23, or is it Mark 23? I don't think I ever really know. Let's call it MK23. That is like barely detailed in there. In fact, it's not even detailed. It's barely blocked in there. I hate drawing shit like guns. I think that when they're drawn incredibly well, like the way like Kenichi Sonoda does it, I think it's like amazing, but it's just not my thing. I suck at it. So you'll see that I sort of put off doing the gun, even though it's like the secondary element of what's going on here. I put it off for a bit. Obviously faces are super fun, so I put a lot of energy into the face, and then that's probably where I had like one of my initial drop-offs while working on this. It's like, cool, his face is done, moving on. So I eventually come back to getting to the gun, but the gun is actually part of my recent push to finish it. Since like January or whatever, I did like the head, and then I did like the collar, I did the chest and his arm and his right leg and shit. And then eventually it's like, okay, I gotta actually be an adult about this and get the gun done. So right now, I'm not gonna do like a brush rundown like I did in the previous video, because this is just super standard stuff. But the rough is done with the fat pencil. The tight lines are done with the fat pencil, and it's all linked below. The fat pencil is linked below. So go ahead and check that out if you care about using the exact same tool. So with regards to me calling this a Procreate 4.1 demo, that's actually only half true, but the good news is that it's 4.1 demo where it counts. So what I mean by that is, since I've been doing this since January, it spans a couple of versions of Procreate, but anything that might be considered like something that 4.1 gives you, I didn't do until recently. So since this spanned so many months and this spanned so many versions, I called it 4.1 because the line art that I'm doing here, there was really no need for any features for 4.1. It's really just drawing. And then, so when you see me get to the actual gun itself, that's where we get into like more recent times. That's when we get into like a couple weeks ago. And then I sort of plow through the rest of it fairly quickly. Now, go ahead and keep watching the line art. There's really nothing much to talk about until we start getting into the gun stuff, I suppose. But I guess this is a good time to start talking about my thought process. With the Big Boss piece, since this is sort of straddled, it was a companion piece to the Big Boss one, and it was a bit of a reimagining of that original one to some degree. What I was trying to think of here was the Big Boss one really tried to match the similar style of Metal Gear Solid 4. At the end of Metal Gear Solid 4, when Big Boss shows up, and that whole game has a look, but that scene really has a look, so I really tried to capture that. With this, it was a little bit more difficult because Metal Gear Solid 1 had just very low poly look about it. I wanted his face to be much more fleshed out than it actually is in that game. Same thing, although I tried to still get the fact that like you can't see his eyes. But the effects, like the sort of things that made that game really special, were they made them so special in their time. And then the motion blurring that they sort of did, it wasn't like a true motion blur, but what I mean is like the like ghosting that they had going on when things would move around and everything, that can't really be communicated too well with a still image. So where I tried to get some of that look was, of course, in the lighting. That game is very blue. It's like blue-green or blue like all the time. So you'll see that towards the end of this piece, I do a lot of last-minute tweaking to make sure that that feels right. And then I try to do something that represents the low texture resolution. When we get to that stage, I'll reference it a little bit, but that's my attempt at trying to solve that problem and really speak to the vibe of the original. Now let's start talking about, since more of him is drawn at this point, let's actually talk about the design that I went with here. So you can see in this reference image, this is a bit of a reimagining that was done later for that collection, where they've really explored what all of these different straps and snaps and all that kind of shit looks like. I tried to take something like an angle where I did some of what's here, mostly what's here, and then introduce a couple of things that might just be bridging the gap for what I'm doing in the illustration, as well as then later when I get to the coloring, I actually start referencing the in-game model a little bit and I tweak things more. So you can see here, for instance, in his picture, you can see the glimpse of his knee pad being metallic, but it's really hard to see if his elbows are metallic. But in the in-game model, they are definitely metallic. So I then go in and change that. So that's sort of how I try to reconcile the design of Snake in this piece. So let's talk about this gun since we've moved on to that. So now it's time to finalize the way the hand is holding the gun and get the gun itself all figured out. You can see me bullshitting in a bunch of the little shapes here. So at this stage, using the sort of multi-window thing you can do on an iPad, I have a second window open that has a Google search of this gun, and I'm trying to look at as many different angles of this gun as possible so that I can try and represent it accurately. Now again, I am not a gun guy, so this is not 100% accurate. If you go and you look at a picture of this gun, you'll find tons of mistakes, and for what it's worth, that's fine. I'm totally cool with this thing having mistakes. I think that if you just sort of look at this illustration, you know exactly what the gun is, and that's really all I cared about. I didn't need it to be super, super accurate. But I wanted to have enough little accurate things here and there so that somebody could at least tell that I gave a shit enough to do some of these details. So there's going to be the length of certain sections that might not be correct. Some of the location of some things isn't correct. And frankly, if Konami hired me to do a piece for Metal Gear, I'd probably make sure it was more correct. But since the art that you people see on this channel is for fun, I just didn't really kill myself over it. You could certainly argue that that means that I didn't respect it enough. Fine. In reality, it was just the matter of I thought that there was enough captured here that worked, and I thought that it was worth moving on, sort of in that spirit of like you'll never truly get the perfection that you're looking for. But I just felt there it is. Let's go from there and keep going forward. And so I think it captures enough of the details there. This was actually really fun to do. I find that a lot of the times when I get frustrated with something and I think that it's going to be either a lot of work or just like a lot of headaches, it's because I'm trying to rush through it. And so with this, I decided, nope, I'm not going to rush anything. I'm not going to consider this gun an afterthought. I'm just going to sit down and pretend for a minute like this whole illustration is just this gun. And then that gave me sort of the creative energy to keep plowing away on it. Now you're also going to see there's some errors that I then later tweak because my reference, there's plenty of reference out there, but sometimes you get stuck looking at one reference and you think that that's enough and you think that, oh, I can tell what that thing is, so then you just keep going with it, and then you get different reference later and you're like, oh shit, that's what that was? And so then you go in and tweak it. That's what happens a little bit with this flashlight part that's on the front here. Right now it's just represented as a disc because I actually thought that it was like an adjustment knob at first. I know that the gun has a flashlight on it, but I just wasn't really thinking that way. So I thought that's what it was. And then later when I saw that it was actually an adjustment for the flashlight, at least that's what it seems to be. Again, not a gun guy. Two things I'm not: gun guy, car guy. So you're never going to see that from me, really. When I saw what that was, I was like, okay, it's a flashlight with a bit of an adjustment thing around it, and I tweak it then at the end of drawing the gun. I'm just going to stay quiet for the rest of this part because it's basically just me fumbling around with drawing this gun. Okay, so now we're out of the gun nightmare and moving on to the crotch nightmare. No, just the pants in general. Getting the straps done. I decide to make the clips that are where his legs connect to his pelvis different, just for the fun of it. And now you'll notice that at this point, while I flesh out the leg and the pouch and the belt and all that shit, that I haven't drawn in his left arm yet. I didn't know what I wanted to do. The composition really didn't call for him knocking on the wall. I think that I probably could have made some adjustments. In fact, I forgot to mention that the original layout for this illustration was actually vertical. It was in portrait because I wanted to make it the exact same as the Big Boss. But since his posture was as such, I wanted to make it horizontal composition. So I could have his arms sort of bending up weird and tapping the wall, and you'll see me play with that a little bit when we get there. But then I just decided to have it going off screen for a couple reasons. One is I would have to rework the whole composition to get that in. Two, we've already got the focal point of his head, and then we've got this gun. Those are two things that you're going to be looking at. And then around this time I decided that, well, actually the whole time I was trying to decide what he was going to be looking back at. Was he going to be looking back at Vulcan Raven again, or was it going to be something different? And so at that point there's a lot of sort of focal points there. And having it so that he's knocking on the wall, he's got the gun, he's got his face, there's the guy in the background, and I had the word bubble idea that was going to get in there at some point. It's like, that's a lot of shit. So I just have his arm go off screen because it also sort of helps with the flow of him moving from kind of off screen into screen, or the camera's panning with him as he moves over, and that whole flow just was more important to me than just cramming in all this shit, like the knock and the face and the gun and the head and blah, 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 and all that crap. But here's where I experiment with it. So I sketch his arm going up. Okay, is he hitting in the wall? No. Okay, what about something more like this? Does that work? No, that doesn't work either. And then I just go into this, which is just arm going off screen. So here, following the same pattern per usual, throw in a rough, this is another layer just to start fleshing things out more, making sure that I'm planning it before I go into finals. The one thing I did here, though, that was more work than I should have, which was just me being kind of absent-minded, is I drew his whole arm, and with the big elbow pad and stuff, like I didn't need that, and so a lot of the detail that goes into his anatomy here is lost, but it's not that big a deal. It's not like it took a long time. The next piece that you're going to see from me has somebody with a lot of tattoos, and I actually did a lot of extra work because her hair covers part of the tattoos, and I drew the complete tattoo underneath, and then it was one of those things where then I turned the hair layer back on, and I was like, oh, right. So look forward to that. Look forward to me completely screwing that up in the next video. So here I realized that the gun needs a little bit more separation from his body, but then I sort of went too much, and now it brings it to this stage where it's at here, which just felt right. Later when we get into the color, there's sort of a lot going on. I mean, there's a lot of detail in general with a lot of lines competing for clarity, and I actually have to separate that gun a little bit when we get to that stage. You'll see that this piece, more than others, went through like a lot of last minute uncertainty where lots of things were getting adjusted, and I'll try to slow that part of the video down, but it'll probably be kind of a pain in the ass to see it all with the way it gets captured. Just know this: when we get to the color stage, I'll explain it now since there's not a lot going on. When we get to the color stage, there's going to be a point where I have color adjustment layers and snow layers and drop shadows and his shadows and all of these layers within the shadows to make the shadows look distorted. And the end of this piece was probably like 2 days of jumping in and looking at it and then being like, oh, no, and just adjusting a bunch of values and then letting it sit and then looking at it a few hours later and being like, shit, no, do this, and then I adjust that. And so that to me is why it's really valuable to do the day later test, where you finish a piece and you're really excited about it and you want to share it with people, but just like keep it around for like a day and look at it and just make sure you weren't rushing it when you were trying to finalize it. Coloring on this, I wanted to make it similar to the way that I colored Big Boss, in the sense that it's flats with shadow layer and just a couple of things like that. It's not crazy sort of overdone with a lot of rendering or anything. The only thing that was important to me was to do that type of simplistic coloring and then have it feel like it was the game that it was in, or at least somewhat like. So here we see there on the skin, we've got the blush, we've got the 5 o'clock shadow, we've got the shadow for his eyes, and you see I changed the colors to more of a purple. Originally I wanted them to be more of like a bluish green, or greenish blue probably is more accurate, but I just didn't like the way that it played with his skin and other values. And I start by going, overall the palette of this is going to go more on the green blue side, but then as time goes on I bring it more to like a true blue, because the more reference I was looking at, the more I was realizing it really is very just blue. So Solid Snake actually has pretty good color blocking, as far as almost like a Capcom-esque color blocking. We've got a lot of the same values and then and colors that are all like in these blues and blue grays, and then it gets like his face, which is just warm, and his hair, which is just warm, so you're always going to see where his face is at all times, which is nice. Depending on the level of fidelity, you've got these metallic call outs which could potentially be used to really draw attention to movement, especially his hand. If you look at it that way, we've got these like sort of high key things on the tops of his hands, so you'll always see where his hands are moving. So that's really nice. The only time it becomes a problem is when the character starts layering upon himself a lot, like he is in this particular pose, and he's not in motion, so your eye isn't catching certain things. And so then it's like, okay, well, now we got to really look at values and really make sure that we're separating things. So that was the quick concrete texture that's already in Procreate. The background gets created very, very quickly with just some solid fills, some blurs, some gradients, and then using the paint splatter in order to produce this snow effect that's going on in the background. And then you saw like that big blotchy snow over the whole thing. So we're going to start with the shading now. Shading is done all using my Select Paint, Select Clear method, which is linked down below if you'd like more details on that. I will not explain it this time, just to spare people who have seen all of these videos. Please click on the link below. You'll understand exactly what I'm doing with the shadows here. So at this point, what I'm thinking about is I'm thinking about the colors that I've chosen. I'm thinking about the colors of the shadow. I'm thinking about, is this shadow going to get me an interesting look plus feel like the game that I'm trying to copy the look of, trying to really make sure it's matching that. And it is and it isn't in some ways. You can see on the skin that color starts looking pretty dead. You can see on the blues and the grays, it works fairly fine because that's desaturated. I wanted one unified shadow, so I could have technically done that type of a shadow just for those and then done a different shadow for the skin, but I instead decided to sort of tweak everything as the process goes on, and I recolorize the shadows to something else. One thing that I want to call out before it happens is I do add some of that saturated edge that happens when shadows transition into light, especially on things that have subsurface scattering like skin. I just want to call that out now because it's going to go by really quick when it happens. And the way that I do that is I just duplicate the shadow layer as a different color, so select it and fill it as a saturated orange because I was just going to keep it on his skin. And then after I've done that, I select the shadows again and delete away from it. And so that's going to make it so that you've got this fuzzy rim that's just on the edge of those shadows. And then because I wanted it just on the skin, I just isolated where the skin was and deleted everything else away from that. When I say Oklahoma, that'll mean keep an eye out, and that means it just happened. That's the code word. That's the safe word for this illustration. So here, just brought the snow back in just to see how the shadows were working with the snow. You could also see when that snow got put back on, there was a quick color layer thrown in. That was just so I could start seeing how all of this was going to feel when it was all working together. The shadows are nice and they're dark in some areas, which they might be a little too dark, which is why you'll see me lessen the opacity on those shadows at some point, just to lighten that up a little bit. you'll see me duplicate the skin and the nose and stuff, and then select the shadows to clear it away and blur it. That's what that was real quick. And then it's set to add, and that's just to bring some of that bloom in. There's a little bit of bloom in the game, and I just wanted to get some of that captured in here. Now I'm going through and putting in a bounce light that's coming from the theoretical snow that's below him. Keeping it real soft just a little bit so that we can flesh out those shapes a little bit more. You can also see that snow that was thrown in there that's in the foreground now. That snow, just so everybody knows, is ultimately going to be produced with a brush where I put it all in, and then I do a motion blur at the angle that it's all whipping around at. So now we've got our bounce light, we've got this sort of bloom coming off of his face, we've got the duplicated lines that are set to a blur, that are blurred and then set to a lower opacity. There we go, there's the snow, and then we're gonna blur it. Now what you just saw fly by was a bunch of texture work that I tried to throw in there in order to degrade the shadows. And I'll talk about that again in a second. Here we're just gonna paint in the guy in the background. I just used like a square brush because I wanted to capture some of the polygons of this guy, the genome soldier. And then he's almost done. I'll just take a minute to talk about the way I did those shadows. So what I did was I took a noise layer and I blew it up way crazy big and set it to a multiply in those shadows. And I eliminated everything but what was in the shadows. And that's why when you look at the shadows here, there's a bit of this rainbowiness. And what I was trying to do is capture that distortion, that artifacting that can happen when you have a low quality texture. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that that popped up all the time in this game. It's just something that's indicative of that era, and so I wanted to... Oklahoma! There it was. Okay, anyways. So I just wanted to make sure that I captured that in there so it felt right. Now just adding a few last-minute blooms, trying to clear up the readability on that gun, and then adding in the shit word bubble, and that basically wraps it up. Like all of these, it comes together super fast in the end. I hope that it was all clear. I definitely recommend going through and scrubbing through certain sections if you need more clarity there. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, please consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you on the next one. And if you're looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you can find me.